It is the evening of April 14th, 1865, just after 10 p.m. John Wilkes Booth has come to Ford's Theater, a theater where he has often performed and a place he knows well. He is here to play his most infamous role, one that will ensure his name is remembered for the ages. It is a moment that has also been eagerly awaited by an outspoken Lincoln hater named George Sanders. Charles Hyam, an historical biographer and author, asserts in his book Murdering Mr. Lincoln that George Sanders is the real driving force behind the assassination of the president.
He saw Lincoln as someone who would, in an aggressive spirit, literally become a dictator of America.
If Hyam is correct, Sanders has successfully escaped prosecution by his contemporaries, as well as the condemnation of history. In the 1840s, George Sanders is a prominent Kentuckian who moves northward to further his career.
He came to New York as a fierce and driving orator, political broker, power broker, and influential figure at every level, not really based on any particular experience, but rather on a belligerent and consuming character.
In 1853, Sanders serves in the administration of President Franklin Pierce, along with then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Sanders is Consul General in London, England.
He set about, while in London, involving himself in the Central Democratic Committee, which was a somewhat American name for what was in fact an assassination bureau.
One of his targets, according to Hyam, is the Emperor of France, Napoleon III. Sanders even calls for the Emperor's assassination, and in July of 1853, such a plot is organized, but fails.
His mission in life, as he saw it, was to destroy the despots of the world. When he came back, as the 50s wore on into the 60s, he became increasingly aware of the presence on the scene of the rising figure of Abraham Lincoln.
Sanders is not alone in his concern that Lincoln has the potential for despotism. In fact, during the Civil War, Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus, closes down opposition newspapers, and allows military searches of homes, among other breaches of civil rights. By June of 1864, Sanders is in Montreal, plotting against Lincoln with the Confederate agents there. In October 1864, John Wilkes Booth arrives on the Montreal scene, seeking assistance for his own plot against Lincoln. He checks into the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel, the epicenter of Confederate activity. It is here, Hyam asserts, that John Wilkes Booth falls under the sway of George Nicholas Sanders.
Sanders was constantly at the hotel, and they were in constant contact from then on.
Charles Hyam believes that the two men's mutual goal is the murder of Lincoln. To this end, Sanders can provide financial and logistical support for a willing triggerman.
Booth would be the perfect instrument. He was in every way entirely suitable for the task.
But while the two want Lincoln dead for political reasons, they can't kill him yet. They need to keep him alive for financial ones. Although the Union and Confederacy are engaged in a bloody war, Lincoln has limited but still allows trading with the enemy. Both Sanders and Booth are profiting from this trade of food, medicine, and other goods. In fact, this commerce makes many men wealthy, including some in Lincoln's inner circle.
The circle of Lincoln's friends benefited enormously. Lincoln's enemies would say that he did it only to benefit those friends.
But the trade policy is controversial, and some Union generals oppose it openly.
And it was stated by more than one general that the war would have ended much earlier if this had not been the case, because we were feeding the Southern Army by this method.
The trade creates a dilemma for Lincoln haters like George Sanders. Even as he and his cohorts sit in Montreal, scheming against the president, they are profiting from his policies.
These people who were wanting Lincoln dead didn't want him dead now because they were beginning to benefit from this trade. And it is quite clear that Lincoln was now of value to them.
According to Hyam, in early 1865, Lincoln makes a fateful decision. A congressional inquiry's scathing criticism of the president's trade policy pushes Lincoln to yield more control of the decisions to General Ulysses S. Grant, a vocal opponent of the trade policy. And with this decision, Lincoln unwittingly removes the final obstacle to his own assassination.
Once he had ceased to support trading with the enemy and handed the authorizations over to Lieutenant General Grant, it was quite clear that whatever usefulness Lincoln had expired.
George Sanders' plan is finally executed on Good Friday, April 14, 1865. Booth uses his celebrity to gain access to the presidential box at Ford's Theater and takes the life of Abraham Lincoln. Hyam contends that the true authors of the plot successfully avoid prosecution.
The conspiracy to kill Lincoln stemmed from George Nicholas Sanders and a few others who were in their group in British North America.
Hyam insists that there is a reason why the masterminds of the assassination plot are never vigorously pursued.
The only possible explanation for avoiding arresting the very people who've killed your beloved president is they would have something to reveal in a public trial. What could that be?
The answer, according to Hyam, trade with the enemy. While the practice was legal, the scope of the enterprise was not known to most Americans at the time. Hyam believes that if the extent of the trade had been exposed during a trial, it might have tarnished, if not destroyed, Lincoln's legacy. But not all experts agree. Many established Lincoln historians dispute the notion that Lincoln's trade policy played a role in his murder.
I think it's a real stretch to find any connection between Lincoln's suspension of trade and the assassination.
They believe the killing of the president was the twisted scheme of one man alone.
John Wilkes Booth was acting on his own, out of passion and a misguided sense of patriotism, and acting, let's never forget, out of a deep racism.